I studied economics I did my undergrad in economics and philosophy at the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. And for a while, to be honest with you, when I started studying economics like 20 years ago, I did not like it all that much. In fact, when I was in high school, I enjoyed philosophy a lot more. And this is a funny story. My father, he was a professor at like the National Public University in Colombia, which meant that I, as his son, could go and study there for free. It wouldn't have been that expensive otherwise, but I could go and study there for free. But my mother, but the thing was that the public university, it has probably improved a bit, but at the time, there used to be like lots of issues, and like the students or the workers would go on strike, and the university would close down, and it was kind of a complicated environment. And so I remember like the scene and my mother being like, no, you shouldn't do that, you will never graduate, it will take forever, are you out of your mind? And then, so Los Andes is like this posh private university, but it had this nice feature, which is that it allowed you to, say, do a double major. And so since I really liked philosophy, but I was a bit unsure, and I kind of liked economics, at least that was a way of convincing myself that that was the right thing to do. So I gave up on the public university, and I went to the posh private one. And I studied economics and philosophy, and for a while, like what I remember from my undergraduate studies was that philosophy was much more fun. And for a while, actually, I thought, I knew that I wanted to be an academic. The other day I found something that I had written a long time ago, and I said there at some point that I know I want to be an academic later on in life, and at the time I thought that I wanted to do a PhD in philosophy. But it turned out that, at least at Los Andes, the type of philosophy that they really like is like 19th century German philosophy. So like, you know, and even 18th, 19th century, so like Nietzsche, Hegel, this type of thing. And so basically my advisor said, well, Luis, if you want us to do a PhD, of course all the good ones are in Germany, so you have to learn German. And that was like the thing that I said, okay, no. And so, but I did, and I guess that's where this story is coming from. I did write an undergraduate dissertation in philosophy, studying Friedrich Nietzsche. And so the header here, it comes from Nietzsche's last book, which is called Ecce Homo, which in Latin means like here is the man. And the subtitle is How One Becomes What One Is. And if you haven't read it, it's an amazing book. It's like a little autobiography. He went crazy like 2 months later, so you can kind of tell that. But it's a great book. So I guess if you want a summary of who I am, how I became what I am, or how I ended up where I am, this is it. So I studied econ and philosophy at Los Andes. After that, I worked for 10 months in the Colombian government, and I hated it. No offense, I know many of you are public policy majors or public policy students, but I worked for the government and it was a horrible experience. It wasn't, at least the particular agency that I worked for, which shall remain nameless throughout this talk, it wasn't very technical, and I was a foot soldier at like the very base of the pyramid. So it would all be like meetings and phone calls, and I didn't get to make any decision on anything, and so it was very frustrating. And so I decided, no, the real world is not for me. I will go back to the fairy castle of academia because I feel comfortable there, and so on. So I went back and I worked as an adjunct professor and an RA again at Los Andes for a while, like a year or two, and then I went to London and I did my PhD in econ. I love how I have to stare back, like I don't remember mine. And then I did my PhD in econ at the LSE. And then I came to Harris. So this is my first job. I'm kind of new at this. And I've been here for 2 years and a bit. This is my third year at the Harris School. So the area that I work in is the political economy of development. So maybe I should add these slides to my classes, but I thought maybe some people will not know what political economy is. So here's a little summary, and I think it's quite witty, so let me go through this. So political economy, you can think of it as kind of the rigorous analysis of politics and its relation to the functioning of the economy. The way sometimes I explain it to people, it's kind of the intersection between economics and political science. And as I was preparing these slides, I thought of this way of approaching it, which, I don't know, I think it kind of makes sense, which is that when we think of political economy, to some extent, what we're thinking of is the invasion of the methods developed and popularized by economists into the field of study that traditionally has belonged to political science. So when you look at the actual questions that we try to answer and the actual topics that we study, for the most part, they are much more similar to what you would learn in a political science degree or you would associate with political science than with what you would associate with economics. So from one perspective, it's the methodological invasion of political science by economists and their rational, cold-hearted mathematical views. So you can think of like formal mathematical models, you can think of like the credibility revolution in empirical analysis, which is just a fancy way of saying if you pick up a book or an article 30 or 40 years ago, you will see that the type of data analysis is very crude, is very correlational, it's not obvious what is causing what. That's something that I will return to later on. And so economists say, no, if we want to understand things, we need to develop these serious formal mathematical models that in a very transparent way capture the phenomena that we want to analyze. And then if we take this to the data, we want to think of some type of experiment, whether it is a field experiment or a natural experiment that allows us to really tease out the different sources of variation and to understand what's going on. But then, if you think that this is economics kind of stepping on political science, you can also think about it the other way, which is to say that political economy comes from understanding that political factors and political agents are fundamental in the functioning of the economy. So you can also think about it as political scientists saying, wait a minute, if you want to understand how governments operate, if you want to understand government spending, if you want to understand business cycles and so on, you need to introduce politics into the equation. So from a different perspective, you could also say, well, it's actually political science telling economics, you need me to understand the type of phenomena you want to explain. So, for instance, politicians have interests that do not perfectly align with those of their constituents. How do you keep them disciplined and so on? Things like this. So that would be my take on what is political economy. Now, what is the political economy of development? I would say that it is the application of concepts and models of political economy to the analysis of topics related to poverty and development. So I started with a broader definition, but now we can zoom in a bit and say, when I talk of political economy of development, I'm thinking of this combination of economics methods and kind of political sciencey concepts and agents applied to the specific topic of poverty and development. Said differently, we want to understand why some countries are rich and some countries are poor, and we think that at the heart of any meaningful explanation, there is a political factor, and there are political incentives and political agents, which I guess is that second bullet point there. In its modern version, it is heavily influenced by the work of Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson 10 or 20 or 25 years ago. I've heard James tell this story. I was once, when I was a student, he came to LSE and we sat around with him and people were allowed to ask him random questions. I was working on taxation in Colombia and I told him about my paper and his answer was something like, oh, I own an apartment in Bogota. I don't know if that's true. And I was a bit unsatisfied by that. I was like, yeah, there's this thing about the property tax, and he was like, oh, I don't know. But what he did say, someone asked him, like, where did you come up with these ideas about institutions as the source of development and so on? And he told us this story about how he had been to a talk by Jeffrey Sachs. This is like 96, so 20 plus years ago. And at the time, what was very popular when thinking about development were these geographical explanations. So the poor is poor, the poor countries are poor because they are all in the tropic. And in the tropic, it is hot, and when it's hot, you don't want to work, or when it is hot, you get sick more easily, there's more infectious diseases, and so on. And so if you look at a textbook or at the major explanations of underdevelopment in the year 1995, this geographic determinism was very popular. And you can imagine people were running these cross-country regressions where you had a dummy for near the equator, and that was hugely significant when explaining poverty and so on. And basically, Jim's story was something like, and there was this other guy, Daron, and after the talk, we sat down at a bar and we were having a beer, and we agreed that that thing was completely wrong. And that the starting point, and I guess this goes back to the main topic that I want to talk about today, which is how research gets actually done. And an important part, as I will mention in a moment, is how do you get an idea? So in the case of these guys, the starting point was what this guy Sachs is saying about geography as the main driver of underdevelopment. That is fundamentally wrong. And so let's work on proving this guy wrong. So you can see like the bitterness and the spite that motivated the whole thing. But a bit more seriously, if you look at some of their earlier work, they have, for instance, this paper called Reversal of Fortune. And part of the argument there is the idea that if development was shaped by these very deterministic fixed factors, then the countries that get like a very good endowment and that have ideal weather and so on, well, they should be rich today, but they should have also been rich 500 years ago. And so one way to start undermining like all of these deterministic explanations is to say, well, look, it turns out that if you look 500 years ago, the places that were rich are very different from the ones that are rich right now. If you look 100 years ago, a place like Argentina was, I don't know, the 5th or the 10th richest country on earth, and now it isn't. If you look at Venezuela 50 or 40 years ago, kind of the same story. And so that was a way of kind of, start breaking these things that was very consolidated in economics. So most of my work focuses on Latin America. Why is that? Well, Latin America, a colleague was telling me the other day that compared to other places, it's good because it has the right combination of functionality and dysfunctionality. So it is dysfunctional. You can think of it almost like a doctor. Like if you're studying medicine and so on, you learn from seeing the sick patients. If they all come in and they're all healthy and it's like, okay, yeah, blood pressure is great, you don't learn a lot. You need some variation. And so Latin America has the right amount of dysfunctionality. There's some corruption, there's some conflict, there's things here and there. But also, as a researcher, if you're going to work in a country, like sometimes you have to literally go there. Or if you're going to run an experiment, then you need a team to be there and to be able to move around and to be safe. Or if you're like me and you just work from the comfort of your office, well, you need data. And so it turns out that a place that is too dysfunctional, there's not even information in the first place. And so that makes things complicated. Also, well, there's a matter of just comparative advantage. Like I know the language, and especially my earlier projects, which were all focused on Colombia, I really exploited the fact that I kind of knew, what the political parties were, how the government functions, what the history of the conflict was, and so on. I will say that now that I've been working in other places like Chile and Peru and so on, one of the things that I find most attractive or most enriching is the fact that if you're going to write a paper on a new context, you have to kind of dive in and learn about the geography and the history and the institutions, and that to me is quite appealing. That's something that eventually the paper gets published or archived or whatever, but that's something that you kind of take away with you, and that's kind of nice. I guess there's also a bit of a home bias, as in we would like to think that these things make a difference at some point potentially, and we can help back home, all the better. So if you think that what we do over there or in any of the other buildings where research takes place, if you think that what we do is easy, you're very wrong. Doing research is incredibly hard. And here I have summarized kind of the basic recipe. If you want to do research, if you want to write an academic paper, these things, especially the things in bold, you have to be able to check all of these boxes. Otherwise, it goes straight into the bin. The first thing, of course, is that you need an idea, a question. Like, I want to understand what's the effect of some factor X on some outcome Y that I care about. It can be a bit more subtle or more sophisticated. I want to understand how the relationship between X and Y is shaped or affected by these other factors Z that no one has studied. So you start with a question. Now, the type of work that I do, which is mostly empirical, then you need to actually have some data. So you come up with a great idea, and then you just have to chuck it because there's no data. For instance, for the type of work that I do, and even also a bit about my own biography, I find I would like to study more, say, the politics and the economics of Venezuela. Venezuela is a hugely understudied country. If you compare, thinking about Latin America, if you compare the number of papers that are written on Colombia relative to the number of papers written on Venezuela, the difference is humongous. And when you think about it, I mean, Venezuela is not that small. It has a very interesting history if you want to learn about natural resources and so on. Big problem, there's not a lot of information. And especially in recent years, there's literally no data. I will talk in a moment about how you can be creative and try to find your ways around these limitations, but that's definitely there. Now, you have a question, you have data. The next step is you need some type of research design. So nowadays, after the credibility revolution, you need to be able to stand up and say, what I'm estimating, the effect of X on Y that I'm estimating, we can think of this as a causal effect. Now, the way I think about causality, and this is just my own cartoon version of it, is if what you have identified is a truly causal effect, then that means that if at random, I am able to manipulate these, not at random in the sense of, if I just pick a random person and I manipulate that person in the way that you're telling me to, on average, I will observe what you're telling me happens. So, think about a very simple example of, does smoking cause cancer? If it is true that smoking causes cancer, then that means that if I just took a random person on the street and asked that person to smoke for 20 years, on average, I would observe that person developing a disease. If the effect is not causal, then if I just take a random person and treat it in whatever way I'm talking about, it may happen, it may not. I was picking up something else. That would be my take on that. It turns out that it gets even harder than that. So as a first year graduate student or as a second year, so you take your econometrics classes and you learn about difference in difference and about experiments and so on, and you think, okay, I have it. And you're walking around, you're reading the paper, and you come up with an idea, and you think, okay, I have a question, I have the data, and I think I can use this type of experiment thing to calculate it. That's not enough. It turns out that then additionally, the results have to actually pan out, and especially they have to be reasonable. Like if you're able to exploit some variation, some reform, and then you thought that the effect would be positive, but it is negative, you have to be able to come up with a reason for why that happened. You cannot just go and present it and publish it and so on. Your findings and your work will be heavily scrutinized. And so it's not just a matter, sometimes maybe in our lectures we're a bit misleading, it's not just a matter of getting the shiny stars and having significant coefficients. You actually have to sit down and think about the numbers and think, does this make sense? Does this go in the right direction? Think about all of these education interventions. Imagine that I told you right now that there's this magic Martinez treatment, and if you read my book, your grades will multiply by 5. Stuff like that just doesn't happen. And additionally, even if the results kind of make sense, let me just emphasize again that you have to be able to pin down the mechanism. So I show you that when you move X around, Y is affected in a certain way. I have to be able to tell you a compelling story of what is happening that is connecting the two things. And then assume that you're able to do that. That's still not enough. Because then additionally, there will be this additional kind of bar that you have to meet in terms of, okay, how are you teaching us something that we didn't already know? And if you're able to say, well, no one had thought of this happening in Colombia or in this setting and so on, then the additional bar will be, and why is this interesting? So as you can see, it's pretty hard. You have to come up with a question that you can sell to people as, it would be great if we knew the answer to this. You have to have the right data, you have to have some type of strategy, you have to be able to, your results must make sense, you must be able to explain them, and so on. And so this is what my life looks like. Now, I mean, getting ideas is hard. I would say that one of the things that I enjoy the most about being an academic is the ability to, in terms of my research, pretty much do whatever I want. So if I find a topic interesting, I can pursue it. Maybe I can talk to my senior colleagues, and maybe some of them will say, I don't know if it's the right time, I don't know if this will make sense, but there's no constraint. You know, if I want to start a new project, I don't have to go to the dean and talk her into it and it's not like in journalism where you need the editor to kind of sign off and say, okay, you can do this. So I enjoy that liberty and that flexibility. How do I get ideas? Well, I'm thinking about work all the time. I hope my family doesn't get to see this day. but sometimes, you know, you're working on a project and one project just leads to the next, because as you work on it, you think, there's this loose end, let me explore it. But also, you start having kind of these way of approaching everything. Like you read a book, or you read a newspaper, or you read a journal, and ideas just start coming to you. One of the projects that I've been working on for a while has to do with the end of the Second World War, and that just happened. And it's interesting. Basically, I won't bore you with the details, but the short story here is that, so you know how at the end of the Second World War, you have the Russians approaching Berlin from the east, and you have the Americans approaching from the west. And you probably all know that after the war, Germany gets split into 4 sections, and that the Russians get a section, and that eventually becomes East Germany. And that's kind of what we all knew. But then I was reading this book about the end of the war, and one of the things that I realized that I thought was interesting was that it turns out that actually, by the time that the Germans surrendered, if you look at that Soviet zone that became East Germany, almost half of it was occupied by American soldiers. So you can imagine the two fronts converging, and at the end of the war, it's not like the Russians always occupied the Russian zone, but for a little while, the Americans were there. And so with some colleagues, with some co-authors, we have been thinking about the implications that may have had for then the developing of the German Democratic Republic, for people's willingness to resist the regime and so on. So the idea there, I mean, it's still in the works, but the idea there is, you know, getting the East German dictatorship sucks, but if additionally, even for a couple of months, you were under American occupation and you thought maybe you were getting a democracy and a different deal, and then the Americans left and the Russians came in, that makes it even worse. So dictatorship, the summary, the slogan for the paper is dictatorship sucks, but it sucks more if you think you're getting democracy. And so we've been working kind of reconstructing the line that separates the Americans from the Russians and collecting data on election outcomes and protests and so on. And so that just came from me reading a book in my spare time. So ideas just come from everywhere. After a while, you kind of realize that it's easy to think of something and get excited. So say politics these days, they're so full of things, and so you just read the newspaper and, you know, there's the shutdown and Trump does this and Trump does that, and you think, oh, there's a paper here, there's a paper there. What it becomes hard after a while is to actually realize that, well, research is costly. You know, a paper from the initial idea to the published version, it can be 2, 3, 4 years. There's lots of resources, RAs, your time, and so on. So if anything, the true masters, what they're able to do is to tell apart very efficiently what's going to work from what isn't going to work, and just separate them. So I told you that data is very important. Now, let me just say a couple of things here. Sometimes data is just a few clicks away. So I usually don't work on experiments. So I usually do not directly collect data myself in the field and so on. I rely mostly on observational data. Sometimes data is just a few clicks away. For instance, I've been working on this project in Peru, and we were able to access online. This wasn't a few clicks away. We had to have someone go to the office of like the electoral agency in Lima and fill in a form and submit it. Okay, so there was a tiny bit of a cost. But it turns out that the Peruvian electoral agency provided us with this amazing data set, which is at the voting booth level. So imagine that you're told that you have to vote at iHouse, that this is your polling station. and then you come into iHouse and they tell you, okay, you're in voting booth 1, this is in this room, you're in voting booth 2, that's in that room. So we have at that level, like within polling station, voting booth level, we know the age of every single voter, like from 18 to 120. So for every booth in one election, I'm not going to tell you right now what we're using it for, but just imagine how rich it is. It's like, I don't know, 10,000 or 50,000 voting booths, and I know the age structure of the electorate at very fine grain. Also, in some other work, I've been using nighttime lights, and it's funny because sometimes people ask me things as if I'm some type of night lights expert, but it turns out that the paper that I've been working on, I was mostly interested in the political economy aspect of it, and so all I did was, there were some other guys that had already figured out how to measure the nighttime lights and had done the calculations. All I did was I went to the website of the AAR and downloaded the replication data and have been using that ever since. So good data is just a few clicks away if you're just a bit creative and so on. Sometimes you really have to be creative. So when I was graduating from the PhD, some of you may know this, but usually in academia, in Econ and Poli-Sci, when you finish your PhD, you have like one paper that is like your main piece of work, and you go on the academic job market with that, and that is your job market paper. And my job market paper was about taxes and oil royalties in Colombia and how they affect the functioning of government. And it had some results that suggested taxes are good, oil royalties not so much. But people were saying, Luis, you need something more, you need something more. And this was like 5 months before the interviews and before it all happened, and so the clock is ticking. And I noticed that there was this Colombian watchdog agency that is the one that prosecutes, say, when the public officials, if they're corrupt or if they for a bunch of things, they prosecute them. And I noticed that if I went on the website of this agency, there were daily bulletins reporting all the activity. So every time they opened a new process or prosecuted a new guy, there would be a news bulletin that said, Luis Martinez, mayor of Cartagena, is under investigation for this and that. It turns out, and so this is full of confessions, this talk, it turns out that my IT skills are somewhat limited. Like I can do basic things in Stata and so on, but all of these fancy things that you're learning about like web scraping and so on, I cannot do it. And so what I do, I just brute force my way through things. And so what I did in this case was I literally sat down, and this took me like 3 weeks or a month, and it was like my full-time job. I would sit down 8 a.m. and I just read these bulletins one by one. And in an Excel spreadsheet, I just created my own data. And then I developed a system where I was able to say, this Luis Martinez is the same as this guy, prosecuted twice, that is horrible. And I was able to kind of connect them and so on. And so basically I just read 2,000 bulletins. I learned a lot about it was very informative about corruption, but that was just a way of like that data, I didn't know how else to get it, so I just, for some other projects, this is also about Peru, we wanted to know whether voters there was this reform that I will tell you about in a moment, we wanted to know whether voters were trying to learn about it. So we found this reform to the abstention fine. Peru has compulsory voting. If you don't show up, you get fined. The fine was reformed, and we found a whole bunch of effects. And we wanted to kind of close the story by saying, well, the voters are responding in this very sophisticated way. It must be because they understand the incentives and they understand what's going on. How can we prove this? And one way we thought of doing that was to say, well, if we can show that people are actively seeking information about the reform, that would be compelling. And so what we did is, and this is just publicly available, you can go to the Google Trends website, and you can look up how popular a given word or a given search term is in a given place, in a given point in time. And so what we did was just using publicly available Google Trends, we created a panel for a whole bunch of search terms, going from the very popular things that everyone searches for, like soccer and porn and things like that, to like government, constitution, and so on. And we threw in some of the terms we cared about not fine for not voting and so on, and we were able to show that. And so this was just, the data wasn't readily made, but if you were just a bit creative, you could get your way around it. Of course, nowadays, the type of thing, like when you see an academic paper, the type of thing that is very compelling is like very fine-grained, preferably from administrative sources, So we were talking in one of my classes, we were talking about this yesterday. If you're gonna study people's incomes, a survey is usually not the most desirable thing, but if you can get like administrative tax data and so on, that is way more desirable. But like I said, even good data without a research design will not take you anywhere. So, naive comparisons are likely to be confounded by unobserved factors. My favorite examples are always, and I'm a big fan of this type of TV, like when you look at the TV news, usually at noon, there seems to be some bias there. Especially where I come from, the TV news at midday are horrible because not a lot has happened, I guess, and it's like 15 minutes of real news, and then there's all sorts of health tips and beauty tips and so on. And they are just beautiful examples of confounded, unidentified claims. So, chocolate cures cancer one week, but then it causes cancer the next week and so on. And of course, as an academic, so go back to how do you get ideas, when I see these people saying chocolate cures cancer, my immediate reaction is, how did they do it? What's the design? Who's the control group? And so on. So you need a design. Of course, the gold standard is an actual experiment. Everything is randomized. You get like a free pass. You say, I did an experiment, and it's like, just sure. In political economy, it turns out experiments have become increasingly common. So people are doing all sorts of fancy things. They are able to convince political parties to let them manipulate how they recruit candidates. They're able to convince candidates to let them manipulate how they interact with citizens. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting work. In some cases, it's just hard to do an experiment. If you're going to study something like what's the effect of repression on political behavior, you cannot just randomly beat people up or something like that. So some questions are hard to do experiments. There's also naturally occurring experiments. I see that most of you are familiar with this. So you can imagine like discontinuities where a policy kicks in or a reform that affects groups differentially. So I brought some examples to illustrate what this is about. So in a project, we've been trying to study what's the effect of exposure to repression. And the context in which we're doing this is the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. And so what we want to know is whether places that were exposed to more repression, that say had more victims, do they behave differently politically? In particular, so we're focusing on this one event. If you're not familiar with the history of Chile, many of you probably are. So Salvador Allende, left-wing president, gets elected in 1970. Then there's a coup in 73 where the General Pinochet takes over power, and then he's in power for like 17 years. What is interesting about the demise of the dictatorship is that it was actually through a vote. In 1988, there was a plebiscite where the people were asked, do you want more Pinochet or not? And he lost. And so that's a nice focal point for our research because we want to know, okay, did Pinochet's loss in 88, did it have something to do with the misbehavior of the regime in the earlier years? And so the idea is where counties that received more violence, where more people were killed as a share of the population, do they vote different? And so, but remember that the problem is that if I just compare places with more victims to places with less victims, no one's going to buy that. Because people are going to say, places with more victims, maybe they were communists in the first place. And so if you tell me that they vote differently later on, maybe it's just that their political preferences were different all along. Maybe the unions were stronger. Maybe hard to measure social capital was weaker and everyone was a snitch and told on each other, and that's why they killed more people. So what we do, for instance, in this case is we say, okay, let us reconstruct, and this has been a bit of a pain, let us reconstruct the network of military bases that were in place at the time of the coup when Pinochet took over. And the intuition there is very straightforward. The intuition is that where the bases are located and where the military are deployed is something that was determined over many decades and many years before these events unfolded. So you can imagine that throughout the 20th century, even 19th century, Chile is fighting with Peru, the War of the Pacific, so there's a base built here, and they worry about the Argentinians, so there's a base built here, and they think about logistics and transport. So our argument is that the location of the military bases at the time of the coup had to do with war with the Peruvians, had to do with a whole bunch of things, but not with political preferences and where the unions were stronger and so on. But then the coup occurs, and you wake up the next day, and if you live near a military base, then you're a bit in trouble, because you're much more exposed to military patrols. If you had, that poster of Che Guevara in your wall, it's much more likely that the military will get to hear about it and they will come knocking on your door. So you can think of a whole bunch of channels where geographic proximity to military bases just exposes you to violence from the military. And so that's what this picture here is showing you. Each dot here is just a district, a commune, a county. And so what you can see is that, in fact, it is true that places that are farther away from the military bases, in fact, experience lower rates of civilian victimization. And if I show you the comparison between places that actually have a base and places that don't, it would even be starker. And so that's our research design. You say, I'm not just going to naively compare places where more people were killed to less. Let me try to come up with some kind of quasi-random source of variation. Let me jump to this one in the sake of time. This is the one for Peru that I was telling you about. And so this would make this is ideal for teaching differences in differences. So Peru, compulsory voting, you don't show up, you get fined. Until 2006, the fine was homogeneous throughout the country. Everyone pays the same amount. And in fact, it's quite a lot. So in 2006, it was roughly 140 soles, which something, at that time, it was something like $40 or something like that. Or say, suppose I'm exaggerating, say that it was $30. Convert that to local currency. I mean that, in Colombian pesos, $30 is 100,000 pesos. If every Colombian pays that fine, that's a lot of money. After 2006, what happens? The districts get classified depending on their poverty level. So some are classified as non-poor, some as extremely poor, and the fine gets segmented accordingly. And so as you can see, the non-poor, which are these squares, they pay a larger fine, the poor a bit less, and the extreme poor a bit less. And so that's the source of variation that we exploit. Everyone was paying the same, and all of a sudden, in a certain year, the fine splits 3 ways. And so you can imagine how this unfolds. I can compare the behavior of voters in these districts to the behavior of voters in these districts relative to any difference that was before. And we find all sorts of interesting things. So actually this talk is, I'm not saying a lot about the results, but say in this case, these voters are extremely sophisticated. So we find, as you would expect, that when the fine is higher, you show up to vote more often. You don't want to pay the fine. But also, this is the part that I like best, which is that Peru is like the US in the sense that, so here you have your driver's license with your address on it. Peru is similar in the sense that you have like a national ID, and your national ID has your address. And so your address determines in what district you're registered to vote. And so one interesting thing that we observe is that after the reform, the number of registered voters in the districts with the lowest fine increases dramatically. And of course, if you think about it, that's a bit weird, because our interpretation is people are changing their address in order to potentially pay a lower fine if they don't show up to vote. Think of what I was saying a moment ago about your results have to make sense. The first time I presented this, someone raised their hand and said, that doesn't make any sense. So you're telling me that people don't work for a day and go and line up at a government office to get a new ID just to avoid paying a bit of a larger... What we did, and this goes to data, is we were able to get these registration rates by age group. And we found that the effect, this jump in the number of registered voters, was entirely driven by the age group 18 to 20. And for us, that made a lot of sense, because when you're 18, you become an adult, so you have to get one of these documents anyways. So the cost of going to the office and getting the document, you have to do it either way. And on top of that, if you're 18, you probably don't live on your own, so you can just say, oh no, I live with my grandma, and the address is, it's easier for you to manipulate. And so we were able to, so Peruvian voters, the other day I was at a conference in Peru, like with public officials, and I told them this, and I made the joke, I said, okay, we find that people fraudulently change their address to pay less, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but I know it's some of you. It didn't go well. No one laughed. I should say, though, that this was a conference organized by like the Contraloría of Peru, so it was like the anti-corruption public officials, so of course it was there. You know, all the other talks were about like how do we reduce misbehavior, corruption is bad, and this and that, and so it was kind of against the grain. So I told you already most of this, which is, you know, people will scrutinize you. Do the results go in the right direction? Are the magnitudes reasonable? Something that is interesting, if say you follow academics on Twitter and so on, there's some things are hard to discuss in the open, but like in these more informal settings, they pop up often, which is this idea about null results. So imagine that you have a paper, or you run an experiment, or you have some variation, and you find that there's no effect. The question is, what do you do? And if you think about it in terms of actual science, like that's the result. This didn't work. But it turns out that there's all sorts of biases against that type of thing. For one, editors do not seem to like null results because they're kind of boring. They want to know what works. They want to know what affects why, not what doesn't. I suppose to some extent it makes sense in the sense that if null results were widely acclaimed, then people could run all sorts of meaningless regressions and study all sorts of, you know, I'm going to study the effect of boldness on academic performance, and then they're completely unrelated, and there's a null. So maybe part of the tension is just that, yeah, embracing null results can like open the gates to just meaningless science, but at the same time, sometimes you feel that these null results, they just end up in a drawer, even though they shouldn't. Here, let me bore you with some statistics. Of course, bear in mind that there's a subtle difference between a precise zero. I have a sample of 10 million, and I can guarantee you that the effect is 0. That's very different from, I ran an experiment with 20 people, and the effect is a 10% increase, but the confidence interval is this huge, so it's not significant, so I don't know. So bear in mind that difference. And even when you find a meaningful and precise effect, you must then try to establish the underlying mechanism. And so, just to share a bit more about myself. So remember how I told you that I liked philosophy and that I wanted to be a philosopher? So then I did my master's at Los Andes, and at that point I thought, okay, the German thing is not going to happen, but maybe I can strike a middle ground that is somehow allows me to put together what I like and learned about philosophy with what I like and with what I learned about economics. And so I thought of, and what made sense was to kind of study the philosophy of science applied to econ, and especially, say, the models that you learn in, I don't know how it is these days, but the models that I learned in undergrad econ, the basic models, like they seemed so unrealistic and so devoid of any connection to real life that I thought, I mean, these economists, they cannot be serious. And so I started doing a bit of research and learning about these, imagine, philosophy of science applied to economics, like these models, what do they teach us, what do they not teach us, and so on. And so eventually, to get my master's, I had to write a dissertation. And my dissertation, I decided to pick a fight with some random economist called Milton Friedman. and basically, Friedman wrote this paper in 1953, where he said that when you think of the models in economics, you shouldn't worry so much about the assumptions, that the assumptions can be as unrealistic as you want them to be, but that what matters is whether the predictions of the model correspond to what you observe in reality. So what Friedman was saying was, stop bothering me about the assumptions, say rationality or perfect markets and so on. If what the model predicts is what I observe, and the model predicts, you know, that if there's a tight connection there, the model works. And my dissertation was precisely about that, kind of saying, come on, that doesn't make sense. Think of the Lucas critique, if some of you are familiar with economics. Like, you may have a very good prediction, but if you don't understand what's going on, if you don't understand the machine, the mechanism, then, for instance, for policy making, that's extremely dangerous because you can formulate policies that then don't make any sense because somehow they unwind and so on. I tell you this story for two reasons. On the one hand, now I work here, so I see like some irony there. On the other, later, after doing my PhD and even today, I came to realize that, and if you ask the average economist, they will tell you that Friedman was just plain wrong, and that what we do in our work differs substantially from that Friedmanian view of the thing. And that what we do, and I've been very insistent on this today, understanding the mechanisms, understanding the causes is a first order thing in academic work in economics. So Friedman's view, which I killed 10 years ago, turns out that is not embraced by anyone, nevertheless. Now, so I'm telling you, you have to understand the mechanism and so on. Let me just tell you one more example from my own work. When I was doing my PhD, I wrote this paper about conflict at the border between Colombia and Venezuela. So Colombia has had this long-lasting conflict, and Venezuela at the time had Hugo Chavez as president. Hugo Chavez what should I call Hugo Chavez was, he embraced a left-wing ideology, and he was very amicable to the Colombian insurgents. And for a while, when I was about to leave for my PhD, there was this big controversy where, say, the Colombian government would say that the Venezuelan government was actively hiding the insurgents on the other side of the border, and the Venezuelans would say that that was not true. And then again, going back to how do ideas arise, I was thinking about that, and then I thought, well, maybe you can use data and regressions to kind of to see what's going on. And the idea that I came up with was to say, well, if the insurgents are hiding on the Venezuelan side of the border, that allows them to carry out their activities and attacks and so on, but it only allows them to do so within a certain range. It turns out that insurgents in Colombia say their transport technology is very primitive. They don't have fancy rockets or anything. So if they want to attack a police station 100 miles away, they pretty much literally have to walk the 100 miles and attack and come back. Maybe they have a jeep, but it doesn't get much more sophisticated. And so you can imagine that having access to this foreign territory allows you to kind of play this cat and mouse game where you attack and you retreat and then you're on the other side of the line and you cannot be touched. But you can only do that within a certain range. And so what I thought that it's not a smoking gun, but it could be informative, was to see whether the intensity of the conflict near the border with Venezuela had taken a turn after Chavez came to power. And in fact, that's what the data shows. So if you look at this plot here, these are just the raw averages. There's no regressions, there's nothing. This is just the number of attacks normalized by population in border municipalities and in the rest of the country. And what you can see is that until Chavez got elected, the intensity of the conflict at the border and everywhere else is pretty much identical. But then Chavez gets elected and you immediately start seeing this discrepancy. And you immediately start seeing much larger many more attacks at the border than in the rest of the country. And so I sat on that idea for a while, like those results made sense, but it was hard to push the paper forward much more because I did not know where the rebels were and so on. Eventually, I stumbled across this book. And if you're interested in the Colombian conflict, this is a fascinating book. So the story here is this. In 2008, the Colombian government bombed a rebel camp that had the FARC's #2 leader, but this camp was located in Ecuador. And what they did was they bombed, and then kind of the commandos descended, and they kind of seized the bodies and the laptops and the things, and they left. And there was this huge controversy. Of course, the Ecuadorians were very rightly offended, and Venezuela also said that this was inappropriate and so on. What is interesting about the story is that as an outcome of the attack, the Colombian government captured the laptop of FARC's #2. And there was a bit of a back and forth about whether the computer was legit, whether it had been manipulated. But what the Colombian government did was it sent it to Interpol, and Interpol said it's fine, it hasn't been manipulated. And then it said, let's let a third party analyze it so that you don't say that this is politically compromised. And they shipped the laptop to a think tank in London. At the time I was studying at the LSE, this was like 10 blocks from where I was. And so basically, this fascinating little book is just the report or the summary of what these people found inside that laptop. And it even includes, I have it in my office if anyone's interested, and it even includes, at the back it has a CD, and the CD has PDFs that include every single email that was in there. And so some of it is entertaining, because sometimes the email is like the guy emailing his wife, and so it's like, how are you here? But for me, that was very useful, because as I read the book, I started to understand a bunch of things. For instance, when I did this type of analysis at the border with Ecuador, and Ecuador had as president Rafael Correa, who was Chavez's ally and so on, I did not find anything similar. And so I thought, okay, that's a bit of a bummer, because in Venezuela I observed it, where the left-wing president is, but in Ecuador not, but this guy is also left-wing. It turns out that if you read the book, FARC's connections to the Chavez regime were very deep. You know, Chavez gave them money, gave them weapons, and so on. With Correa, it was very different. Even though FARC approached the Ecuadorian government many times and tried to reach some type of agreement, never was such a thing accomplished. And so that's just an example of how, as I read the book and I started getting like all the anecdotal evidence and so on, I said, okay, yeah, this makes sense, and I pushed through and so on. So that's that. And then, you know, like I told you, and this is the hardest bit. Like if you ask me as a third-year assistant professor, like what's the hardest part of your job as a researcher, I would say it is this. Because after a while, you know, there's reforms everywhere, there's policies everywhere, you can run experiments, like variation and data and so on, you can come up with. But to be able to come up with a good pitch that people will say, yes, this is the most interesting thing I have ever seen, that is very hard. And sometimes when you see these academics that publish a lot of papers and that, you know, the real stars of the profession, what I envy the most is that I feel like, you know, I'm working there on my laptop and I think, if it was this other guy with this same data and this same thing, the guy would know, or the lady would know, how exactly to sell the paper so that everyone likes it. And so applied lesson is that the same findings, you know, the same design, the same data, the same results, they can be framed and sold in a whole bunch of different ways. You can emphasize the methodology, you can emphasize the results, you can emphasize the policy lessons, you know, you can think of all of these things. And that, to me, is just the hardest bit. And I think that I'm pretty much done, but just to give you an example, the paper on Peru, it started as a fairly trivial exercise. I tell you, there's a fine for voting. When the fine goes up, people vote more. And you probably did not me running a study and working for 6 months in order to learn that people do not like paying fines and they respond to prices. So then, this project that I've been working on, it has been an exercise in how do we make this interesting? How do we get above, you know, you can imagine you go to a seminar, you start talking, and 5 minutes in, someone is going to say, this is very boring, this is very obvious. And so how do you answer that question? So for instance, in the case of Peru, one way is to say, well, let's not just look at voter turnout. Let's look at a whole bunch of other margins, and let's think of this as a more illuminating exercise about voter rationality. So these people are highly sophisticated, they search the web, they change their address, they do a whole bunch of things. Another one is just to say, well, for policy, this matters a lot. Low turnout is a big deal. Say here in the US, there's all of these campaigns. Before the midterms, a friend sent me a video and it was Obama debunking 7 myths of why you shouldn't vote. And you see all these figures, you know, the Obamas, they go to a rally and it's all about you have to turn out, you have to turn out. So turnout is a big deal, and there's a whole lot of policies. We don't know which ones work, which ones don't. So another way to sell our paper could be to say, well, I can tell you what's the effect of a $1 incentive. So if you come up with a very fancy policy that costs a lot of money, let's compare the impact that you observe to my $1 impact. And if I win, then we shouldn't do what you're saying. Let's just give people money. Yet another one, and I know that you're very interested in public policy, another one that is very interesting in this setting is you have an experiment, you learn from your experiment, and then you want to scale up these lessons into like more general public policies. But there's a lot of issues that arise. One, for instance, is that one thing is to have these NGO workers that are very motivated and you pay them well, and another is to have like government bureaucrats doing the same thing. It can also be that, say, if you're going to run an experiment, the type of NGO that is willing to work with you works in a setting where like all the stars align and everything works well. So scale-up is full of issues in terms of implementation, in terms of political resistance, and so on. So another way to pitch this is to say, well, all of these things about turnout, they are all about these very tiny, weeny experiments. We're looking at like a nationwide policy with 20 million voters. So, you know, pay attention to us. Do not pay attention to the crappy experiments. But so, the only point I wanted to make was how you take a kind of obvious, kind of trivial finding, and you just have to keep spinning it until you see like, okay, of what I did, this is what people really care about. So the bottom line would be, and this is my last slide, would be that academic papers are an exercise in persuasion. If you haven't, you should read Deirdre McCloskey, who is kind of a philosopher, I guess would be a way of describing her, who has made this point very emphatically. And so that is to say, I mean, what I find interesting about our line of work is that to some extent it is science. You know, think of like natural scientists, like white coat science. But to some extent, it is also like journalism. Or to some extent, it is also like being a lawyer. You know, the jury are your peers, your referees, and they're incredibly mean. And you have to convince them above a certain standard that what you're saying makes sense. And so this is something that I actually learned from a senior colleague a while ago. But it's all about persuasion. You know, it's I guess this is kind of a very postmodern approach. It's not about there's truth and there's the opposite of truth, whatever that, it's late, I cannot remember. There's truth and there's not truth, and somehow we're kind of, you know, we are capturing like this eternal, unmodifiable thing. That's not it. It's all about persuasion. You talk to a group of people, you present your work, and you want these people to leave the room thinking, yeah, that makes sense, I'm convinced. It's all about persuasion. So it's a combination of all of these different things. Of course, I guess by the time I finished my slides, I was a bit bitter. So of course, there's also an element of politics and who are your friends, and the editor of this journal hates your advisor, and so you can even, those things are there. But for the most part, there's all the good things. Okay, and so that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. Amazing. I mean, I learned so much. Thank you guys for coming, and I have to confess that I like to organize this kind of things because you learn so much from your experience, and I think now we have experience, we have some ways to you know, to do our research and things like that. So please now feel free. I mean, we have nice drinks there, we have some food there, but take the opportunity to make some questions. For sure, there is a lot of things that we want to ask you. For instance, for me, I know that you love to read a lot. And not only papers, for sure, most of the time you're reading papers and things like that, but maybe in some book in the literature or something like the book that you mentioned back in England, you find some idea, maybe in a poem, a poetry. Have you had any experience about that?
I mean, that would be a bit far-fetched, but say the book about Berlin, that was just a historical account. So I like reading these World War II books. It's true that say there are topics that I find kind of attractive and I don't know a lot about, and so maybe the starting point is to say, okay, let me buy a book about this and see where it leads me. I would have to think of an example. I mean, there's always some connection with art in a certain way. Like when we've been working on the Pinochet dictatorship thing, as I was working on the thing, I created a playlist Because as I worked on the thing, it reminded me of all the punk rock bands that I used to listen as a teenager. And so I started like, oh yeah, that was a great song, and I would listen to it. And I ended up creating a playlist, which I now, the other day I was presenting the paper, and like 30 minutes before, I thought, let me listen to the playlist. It's set and so on. So yeah, there's a bit of that.
There's a lot.
Yeah. Yes.
So you, thank you for this. So you said at the beginning that you started in Latin America,
Mm-hmm.
and the part of it was your knowledge of the language, the history, and all that. So that's something I've been feeling a lot now that I started doing some projects, for example, in the Middle East, and I just started like even Googling stuff in Arabic was impossible.
Mm-hmm.
How did you feel when moving to, now that you are doing projects in other places like Europe, do you feel that this is still a problem, or do you found ways to overcome that?
Mm-hmm.
Or do you still feel that having that regional knowledge is so important? And I just want to say it's funny that you didn't go to Germany because you didn't want to learn German, and now you have a project in Germany.
Exactly, that's true, that's true. But, so the German paper, my two co-authors are German, but it turns out that at first, since I was the one that read the book and knew the story, so initially I was the history expert in the project. And so when we were trying to figure out what towns were liberated by the Americans and by the Russians, for some strange reason, that was my homework at first. And I struggled a lot. I used Google Translate. It's relatively good. Because I realized that for lots of these things, like if you look up a town or a district, the English Wikipedia will give you some stuff, but the German Wikipedia, that's a real... And so I would just translate it. I mean, language is still a barrier. The other day, this paper that I wrote about nighttime lights, I was asked to provide some comments for some outlet in South Korea. And so the guy emailed me, and I replied, and I said, look, this is what the paper is like, and so on. And then he was like, okay, this is published now. And it was a weird experience to like click on a link and see your face. And the name was written in like in Roman language or whatever that is, in the Roman alphabet, but everything else was in Korean. And then the best part was that a couple of days later, I got an email from some other random guy that was like, I see you spoke to these people. I don't think that what they're saying is true. Let me tell you the true story, because the guy had asked my opinion about some controversy in Korea regarding the head of statistics. And I was being very like, I don't know, well, what my paper says is this. And then this other guy is like, well, you know, what they're saying is not true. And then I was like Google translating the thing. And I was like, Google translate. But still today, I have good friends that say are Colombians and do work like in the Philippines and so on, and or in other settings. And it is a barrier. Like I am worried of like engaging in projects where I don't, because that's crucial. And say, the other day I was talking to James Robinson, and he was telling me how if you think of what the Acemoglu-Robinson production function looks like, he was telling me that it is him that, and it kind of makes sense that it is him when you read these papers, they are full of like these historical anecdotes and examples, and here's the date, and you know, and the revolution in England in the 16th century. That is what James does. And so it is crucial when you're working on a topic to really immerse yourself and really learn about everything. Also because then you're at the seminar and some random person asks a question of, well, but didn't you know about this other thing? And you'd never want to be caught by surprise. So yeah, that's that.
Well, I'm a guest, but so I have a question, because I think the most important slide is the one that you showed at the end. This is my take on political economy, and these big questions, the Acemoglu and Robinson reversal of fortune paper, which is like this huge thing, you know. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have these experiments or small interventions, but in the middle there's a big vacuum of what we know and what is useful. So I wanna just to get your sense. What's your take of having like been in this space for I don't know, for so many years, and what's what's really useful, and how do you learn about it? And
I think that what you say is absolutely right, which is that when you're trying to sell your work, or when you're thinking of what you're doing, there's definitely one dimension is the breadth of the question or the project. And so there are these big questions, but then that usually is negatively correlated with how precise and convincing your answer can be. So there's usually a trade-off. And so what you mentioned about like the experiments versus Acemoglu and Robinson, I think you're spot on in that, say, Daron and Jim, they are like these big question types. And if you read it, there's a model, and then maybe, let's turn the camera off, there's some regressions there. but it's more about, let me tell you, this model illustrates this big phenomena and so on. But then the experiment, it gets increasingly tiny and increasingly precise. Like I get it, I learn very much, and I'm incredibly convinced about this very tiny thing. And the frontier, you can imagine that, and usually what we are told and what we tell our students is, you definitely want to be at the frontier. You don't want to be inside. So if you're going to be telling me something about a very precise question, like what's the effect of the abstention fine in Peru, then you better be able to give me a very compelling answer, to have very good data and a very good strategy and so on. I would agree with you that kind of things tend to have this bimodal distribution, and it's hard to be right at the middle. In general, and I guess I agree with you, this goes back to this idea of how you sell, like for whatever level of precision you have, you always want to kind of tilt the balance and say, this is very general interest, this is very, we're not just learning about this very specific setting, we're learning about like these broader things.
Follow up on that?
Yeah.
Do you apply an additional filter on like when you decide your projects, whether they will have more impact on this frontier, like, or?
It's because if you think of the stage I am at in my career, I'm still an early, like a young scholar, so I still get excited about ideas, and when I get excited about it, I have a little notebook and I write them down, and sometimes, even though I promise not to do it, I will waste an afternoon kind of just looking things up but my short answer to your question would be that it's hard to do what you're asking, like to say, if there is this thing, and there is the data, and there is the design, and I think this is kind of interesting, it's hard to shoot it down. So in general, for me, things start very concrete. Like there's this setting, and I read about this thing in the paper, and so there could be something here, like very journalistic in a sense, like follow the story. And then it's more, you get a specific thing, and you think it can work, and then you think of how you can expand it. It is true, I do sometimes, but that's the ideas that like come when you're in the shower, that I think of like like football. Like I think of something, and well, we could do this thing about the referees and whether they're biased and so on. And then you think like, no, come on, that's... So I set the bar very low, usually, to get started. That would be the honest answer.
You have a question? Yeah, I think you answered a little bit, but on one of your slides when you talk about why you were interested in Latin America, you mentioned like home bias, etc., and I get that. I'm an international student as well. I'm wondering, like, and this might be a sort of philosophical question, but like, what do you think is the legacy of research as a field as a whole? And I ask you that because you spent, say, 10 months in the government, working in the government, and now you are a professor in a professional program, etc. So, what is research as a whole trying to do when it says moving the needle forward, etc.?
I mean, it depends. Sometimes when I'm bitter about not winning a Nobel Prize, I think, well, we're all going to die anyway. I think that my experience in the real world was very idiosyncratic. So even though that was the year 2008, it wasn't that long ago, but I would say that this idea of like evidence-based policy making had not reached these people. And in fact, the same government agency that shall remain nameless, recently I tried setting up a project with them, and this was an experiment. And I mean, let me share my frustration with you. Actually, let's go back to 2008. In 2008, when I started working for these people, we were asked to put together a policy for the poorest region in the country. It had been this thing that like the director of the agency had been cornered by the congressman from that region, and they had said, what are you going to give us, what are you going to give us? And she said, okay, well, come up with a policy for you. And I was put on that thing. And it turns out, I remember this big meeting, and so this is like, what are the region, it's a region in Colombia in the Pacific, it's called Chocó. And I was sitting down with all of these public officials, so there was the representative of the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of this, and they were like, okay, what's the policy for Chocó? And the poverty of the discussion was, basically, no one cared. It was like, let me just, Ministry of Transport, what do you think? Like, what's the big challenge and so on? I don't care what the big challenge is. These are the roads that are being built, just write that down. And that was kind of and so that was what frustrated me, and I said, I'm out. And then 10 years later, but again, this is just one agency. I mean, do not abandon the program. This was just one agency, so I'm trying to set up an experiment with them. And in fact, and I don't run experiments, so I bought the books and okay, how do you randomize and so on, and the seed, and I did the whole thing. And basically, so it was this intervention it was within towns, some projects get the intervention, some projects don't. And the idea was to randomize, so these towns have a bunch of investment projects, and we were going to do a treatment in some and not others. I randomized the thing, it is balanced, I do like 10,000 randomized, I mean, it was beautiful. And it was also, because the public sector, be warned, because I think this is a universal rule, like things will not move for 6 months, and then you get an email that says, okay, this has been approved, it is due tomorrow. And so this was something like that. I had not heard from these people for months, and then it was like, you have 2 days. So I rush, I download the book, I call my colleague Chris Blackman, like, Chris, I don't know how to randomize, and the works. I get the thing done, I send them the thing, like, here's the randomization, here's the assignment. They get back to me, so this is a Monday, they get back to me Friday, and they say, well, it turns out that the data we gave you, it was a bit outdated. So those projects, half of them were already finished. And so what we did was, well, when we got to the town, we just picked a few. And so it was all ruined, and then, that was the end of that. So you do get cases like that where, say, this particular agency, and what was even sadder about this story was that these people, this was like a pilot, and the idea is to see whether they scale this up to the whole country. And so I thought that this was important. We're going to test the intervention, see if it works, and then you're going to roll it out. And basically it was like, well, and on top of that, we did the math, and by the time that you will be able to tell us whether this works or not, we will already have to have decided, so we're going to decide anyways. And so like the engagement with evidence and data and like actually learning what things work was null. And so for these particular people, it remains null. But I think that's just my own sad experience. Just think of what has happened in the past decade or so. These places like IPA and JPAL and so on, the IGC in London. Like the engagement of academics with policymakers and the adoption of like evidence-based lessons, I would say that it's at its global maximum, and it has exploded in recent years. So there's every reason to be optimistic, even if occasionally people are jerks.
Well, maybe we can have these three last questions.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
Brian, Laura, and Sid. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Liz. When I think about political economy, usually I think about creating evidence-based analysis for creating better governance as well, right? Or in your case as well, to telling the truth about what is happening in the case of Chavez with the FARC, or in the case with authoritarian governments with the inflation of GDP. But usually while doing so, I'm trying to create policy around using this as a base. You are questioning the current structure of power. And normally that's gonna have more obstacles than any other field of policies, because we're talking about reforming political institutions sometimes. Do you think that is it possible for political economists to inform politicians about how to create better institutions, considering that usually they don't have, or we suppose that they don't have the will to do so?
That's a very fair point. Like if you're working on education or health, maybe it's much easier to have your insights applied, and to some extent, to stand up and say to the Colombian mayors, like, I know you're stealing the money, or that doesn't go very well. On the one, I mean, there are cases where that does happen, but also sometimes, the politicians will come up with their ideas, sometimes crazy, sometimes not so crazy, and at least having these insights allows you to comment and say, wait a minute. So to give you an example, recently in Colombia, there was a vote, like some members of Congress put forth a series of proposals to try to reduce corruption, and people went out and voted and said whether they wanted these implemented. And it didn't go through, like the vote was not high enough. People did vote in favor of these measures, but turnout wasn't high enough for it to be binding. But then that's a good example, because some of these ideas, like they were filled with good intentions, like we want to reduce corruption, so let's reduce the salary of Congress people, I think was one of them, or let's limit the number of terms that members of Congress can serve. And then I remember one of my friends saying, and I even read about this on Twitter, saying, wait a minute, I have done research on this thing. This was a blog post actually, not Twitter. I have done research on this thing of say these term limits, and I know what the effects of that are. And so when you set a term limit in these settings, what ends up happening is that the congressman then gives his seat to his wife or his nephew or his cousin and so on. And so if the point is that you want to have some type of rotation or renewal, these term limits are not as effective as you think, because the seat just ends up in the relative's hand. And reducing salaries, even though when you're feeling very frustrated with the political system, like you feel like punishing these people, it doesn't make sense, because in fact all the evidence suggests that it's not obvious that increasing salaries attracts much higher quality people, but there is consistent evidence showing that reducing salaries is just an incentive for adverse selection. If I have a good outside option, I don't want to go to politics, and now I want to do it even less. But also, once I'm in politics, it's a good incentive for me to try to extract rents and so on. So I would say that there are cases in which maybe at least as a commentator you can like raise the red flag and say, this is not the type of reform we want to implement.
Great. So Laura and then
I wanted to, you kind of answered in a way, but has there ever been a time where you got so attached to like one paper or like one project, and it either like you wanted to get a specific answer and like didn't get there, like took you?
Yes, there is a bit of that, and that goes back to this idea of trying to screen the ideas, because once you're attached to it, like you want to see it all the way to the end. The paper we've been writing about Germany, that is one of those ideas. So I mean, I read that book a couple of years ago, and we don't even have a draft, and it has just been this process of, okay, we collected the data. At first, we thought it was going to be something about the experience of liberation, like the Russians engaged in a lot of abuses and sexual violence and so on. So we thought of doing something where we compared the attitudes of men and women and trying to argue, well, there's a difference, there's this arbitrary line, and women on this side were much more exposed to violence, to sexual violence at the hands of the Russians. But then we were using this German survey, and the results were kind of noisy, so then we changed focus, and so it gets a bit suboptimal, because actually, like, it's a sunk cost. At any point in time, you should think, does it make sense to keep at it? But after you've spent months or even years working on something, like the idea of just, deleting the files or something, or just shutting the folder, that's very unattractive. So it does happen. I suppose that a more accomplished academic would say you have to learn where to stop or something like that. But yes, yeah, that's definitely there.
So recently I've had the privilege of being privy and being a part of the policymaking process. And something that I've noticed is when you're making policies, when you're suggesting policies either for a politician or as a politician, you're mainly influenced by ideology, you're mainly influenced by public opinion, and you're also influenced tremendously, especially in times of crises, by uncertainty. A really good example is just FDR during the Great Depression and during World War II, where you don't really have the data available, you don't have a body of research available. And at the same time, going to Harris, you kind of realize that a lot of policy analysis or political economy and economics papers really focus on looking in hindsight. I think there was a quote about basically economics is like driving a car just by looking in the rearview mirror. So that's how it often feels. And I'd say beyond doing literature reviews and beyond doing kind of cost-benefit analysis based on current data available, how can the academic side of policy influence the policy-making decision process better?
I can say a couple of things about that. The first one is that you're absolutely right about the uncertainty. And that's something that if you just follow current political affairs and not just current, it's something that I see that skillful politicians are very good at exploiting. And so you can probably think of examples where you're telling someone like, yes, you dislike this, so this is what we should do. And the type of thought that crosses my mind when I see these things happening, like the connection between the motivations posited by the politician and the policies that are being suggested, to me indicates clearly that say they are exploiting the fact that the voter does not fully understand. Like, there's the policy, the lever that I can pull, and then this is going to affect this thing, which is going to affect the outcomes that you care about. So at the end of the day, the voters, of course, they'll want to have a job, they'll want their kids to have a better education. Like, there are these outcomes that we care about, but then the mapping from the policies that can be implemented to those outcomes, I agree with you, is highly uncertain. But politicians are very good at pretending that they kind of know what that is like. Sometimes commentators are very good at that too. So as an academic, one thing that really frustrates me is when I read opinion pieces like op-eds. Because in my line of work, like every single sentence that I write must be backed, by data or by a reference or by, and then you read these op-eds and it's like, yeah, of course, the tax reform is not going to work because it's going to work, it's going to generate employment and trade and this and that, and you're like, this is all speculation, or like, where are your numbers? Or so I would say that you're absolutely right. The uncertainty is huge, and in fact, it is an important part of the policy analysis. Now, regarding the hindsight aspect, some people would say that all social science is context dependent. So again, you can write a paper on a specific thing, and someone can raise their hands and be a jerk about it and say, well, but that's about Peru, and who cares about Peru? And you're, or rather than who cares about Peru, like, how do we know that what you're capturing here is at play anywhere else? And to some extent, those people are always right, because there's always like this very specific aspect of the institutions, the culture, the history that is at play. Like, what is truly generalizable is very little, like universally generalizable. So to some extent, those people are right, but still, I would say that we do learn from the historical examples. So I would advocate for the middle ground, where the lessons from any particular historical episode or experience, they are informative, but they are not fully informative. So the fact that a policy did not work in one setting does not mean that it will automatically work in another, and the other way around. And I think that that's kind of the right way to approach it.
Wonderful. Guys, thank you very much for your time.